Far beyond Earth, where stars shimmered like tiny drops of glass, a vast research station floated in silence above a newly discovered world. Inside, humans and an alien race known as the Varex shared the same corridors but rarely exchanged more than glances. The Varex were tall, scaled, and built like warriors. Their movements were quiet, precise, and always cautious. They had once been feared across the galaxy for their hunting instincts, and even now, the human crew tread carefully in their presence. Trust was a slow, fragile thing in space. Late one evening, the station lights dimmed to night mode. Most of the crew had retired to their quarters, the hum of machinery filling the halls with a low, steady rhythm. In her small room, Dr. Liana Hayes sat by the window, her reflection merging with the distant planet below. She had spent the day studying soil samples and cataloging alien flora, exhausting but fascinating work. As she unwound, she reached for a small wooden hairbrush, an old item she had brought from Earth. She began to run it slowly through her hair, each stroke calming her thoughts. The act was simple, ordinary, something purely human. Unbeknownst to her, someone was watching. Across the corridor, behind a transparent divider, one of the Varex guards stood at his post. His name was Kareth. His golden eyes followed her movements, not with hostility but with silent curiosity. The brush in her hand seemed like a mystery. Among the Varex, grooming was a matter of function, rough, quick, and mechanical. But the way she moved the brush was different. It was gentle, rhythmic, and purposeful in a way that didn't make sense to him. It looked peaceful. Liana noticed his reflection in the glass and paused for a moment. Most people avoided eye contact with the Varex, unsure how they might react, but she didn't feel threatened. Instead, she smiled slightly, offering a kind of silent greeting before going back to brushing her hair. Kareth didn't move. His head tilted to one side as if trying to understand the purpose behind the act. To him, humans were noisy and unpredictable. But this small, quiet ritual was something else entirely. For a long time, they stayed like that, one brushing her hair in calm repetition, the other watching in wordless fascination. The moment was oddly peaceful, bridging the space between species without a single word spoken. When Liana finally set down the brush and turned off her lamp, Kareth remained there for a few seconds longer, his gaze fixed on the reflection of the small wooden object on her desk. Then he turned and walked down the hall, deep in thought. He didn't understand what he had seen, but it lingered in his mind like a question that refused to fade. For the first time since arriving at the station, he wasn't thinking about duty or survival. He was thinking about something beautifully, strangely human. The next morning, the station came alive again with its usual rhythm, footsteps echoing through the metal corridors. The hum of machines and the quiet beeping of monitors. Kareth, the Varex soldier, took his position as he always did, standing tall and still near the observation deck. His posture was rigid, his eyes scanning the area with precision. But today something in his mind felt different. He kept recalling the human from the night before, the way she had sat quietly, moving that strange object through her hair in a slow, careful motion. It hadn't looked like work or necessity. It had looked deliberate, meaningful, like some kind of ritual. He couldn't understand it. Among his kind, grooming was nothing but survival. Varex cleaned their scales with sharp tools, scraping away dirt after long hunts or patrols. It was efficient, harsh, and without emotion. There was no time for softness. Yet what he had seen in the human's actions seemed to go beyond survival. There was rhythm, patience, even comfort. She wasn't repairing or sharpening. She was caring. The word felt strange in his thoughts. Varex didn't think about comfort, and they didn't understand gentleness. But last night, watching her, he had felt something unfamiliar. Curiosity that pulled at his mind long after he left his post. Throughout the day, Kareth found himself distracted. He watched other humans move around the station, noticing small gestures he had never paid attention to before. How they smiled, how they shared small words just to fill silence, how they touched each other's shoulders in reassurance. None of it served a clear purpose, yet somehow it kept them connected. His kind did not do such things. To the Varex, strength meant distance. Connection was weakness. But here, strength seemed to come from closeness. Later that evening, when his shift ended, Kareth walked through the human quarters more slowly than usual. The corridors were quiet, lights dimmed for rest. He stopped near the glass divider again. Through it, he saw Dr. Liana sitting at her desk, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She was writing something in a tablet, perhaps notes, perhaps thoughts. And then, like before, she reached for that small wooden brush and began to comb her hair, slow and calm. The sound of the bristles moving through strands filled the quiet space. Kareth found himself leaning slightly closer, his eyes following the movement. It wasn't just grooming anymore. It was almost like art. He wondered what it felt like. Did the act ease her mind? Did it remind her of her home planet? For the first time, Kareth didn't see a human as an assignment to guard or a species to study. He saw her as something else, something alive, fragile, and full of meaning. The Varrock soldier who had once viewed all softness as weakness now stood still, his chest rising in slow wonder. In that small, silent moment, he realized the universe held a kind of beauty he had never been trained to see. That evening, the station was quiet again. The humans had finished their shift, and most were resting in their cabins. The hum of engines filled the silence, steady and low, like a heartbeat that kept the whole place alive. Inside her small room, Liana sat by her desk, running her fingers through her hair as she looked out the window. She was tired, her mind heavy from hours of work and reports. Without thinking much, she picked up her old wooden brush and began to stroke her hair, slow and calm. The familiar motion always helped her think. It reminded her of home, of her mother sitting by the window on Earth doing the same thing. It was a small ritual of comfort in a place that felt anything but human. Across the hallway, Kareth was once again at his post. His golden eyes caught the light as he noticed her through the divider. This time he didn't look away. The strange object she used had fascinated him since the first time he saw it. He didn't understand its purpose, only that it seemed to give her peace. He stood silently, his head slightly tilted, observing every movement of her hand. There was no fear, no defense in her posture, only calm repetition. After a few moments, Liana glanced up and saw him watching again. At first she froze, her hand pausing mid-air. Most of the crew avoided long eye contact with the Varrocks, and even she had been warned that they didn't like being stared at. But something about his gaze felt different tonight. Not harsh or cold, just curious. She smiled a little, a soft, polite gesture. Then she lifted the brush slightly, holding it in front of her so he could see it clearly. "It's for untangling," she said in a quiet, steady voice, even though she knew he probably didn't understand her words. Her tone was gentle, not teaching or commanding, just sharing. Kareth tilted his head, his expression unreadable, his bright eyes narrowing in thought. His people didn't speak the same way humans did, but he seemed to be trying to understand. Liana hesitated, then demonstrated. She pulled a lock of hair forward and brushed through it slowly, letting the bristles glide through the strands. The motion was smooth, deliberate. She hoped he could see there was no threat, no reason for fear. It was simply something humans did to care for themselves. For a second, Kareth's gaze shifted to the brush, then back to her face. There was a strange flicker of recognition in his eyes, as though something clicked. When she finished, Liana placed the brush down gently and gave another small smile before turning back to her work. Kareth remained there for a while longer, unmoving. The image of her brushing her hair stayed in his mind, replaying again and again. For a warrior raised to see softness as weakness, this single act of care felt like an entirely new language, one that didn't need translation. And though not a word was shared, in that small moment between them, understanding quietly began to grow. The following day, the station buzzed softly with activity as researchers began their morning routines. Liana was busy reviewing samples in her lab, surrounded by monitors and the quiet hum of machines. She was focused, lost in her work, when the door slid open with a gentle hiss. Standing there was Kareth, the Varrock soldier, towering and still as ever, but this time he wasn't empty-handed. Clutched awkwardly in his clawed fingers was a strip of soft fiber, torn from the lining of his uniform. His expression, usually unreadable, held something close to hesitation. Liana looked up, surprised. "Kareth," she said softly, setting down her tools. The Varex didn't usually enter human labs without a reason, and certainly not while holding scraps of fabric. For a moment they stood in silence, the hum of the machines filling the air between them. Then, to her amazement, Kareth lifted the fiber to his head and began to mimic the motion she had shown the night before, slowly dragging it across the ridges of his scalp. It was awkward, stiff, and a little clumsy, but there was no mistaking it. He was trying to copy her brushing. Liana blinked, a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't mockery or shock, just pure delight at the sight. The idea of a Varex, a member of one of the fiercest species known, standing in her lab attempting a human grooming gesture, was almost unbelievable. Yet there he was, earnest and focused, as if afraid to make a mistake. His movements were careful, almost reverent. When the fibers snagged slightly against the rough edges of his scales, he paused and looked at her for guidance. Without thinking, Liana reached for her brush from the desk and stepped closer. "Like this," she said gently, demonstrating the smooth motion again. She ran the bristles through her hair with a soft sound, then offered the brush to him with both hands, a small gesture of trust. Kareth hesitated, glancing from the brush to her face. Slowly, he reached out and took it, holding it delicately, as though afraid to break it. He tried again, brushing the side of his head with surprising gentleness for someone with hands built for battle. The bristles caught on the edges of his crest, and he made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh, or its alien equivalent. Liana couldn't help but smile wider. "Not bad," she said, though she knew he couldn't understand her words. He seemed to sense her tone, though, and tilted his head in a small, almost playful motion. For a moment, the lab felt different, lighter, warmer. The hum of machinery faded into the background, replaced by an unspoken connection. Liana realized that what she had thought of as a simple human habit had become something more, a bridge between two species that once had nothing in common. Kareth handed the brush back carefully, his golden eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. He nodded once, a gesture of respect, and left the lab. As the door closed behind him, Liana stood there smiling, the brush still warm from his hand. She had just witnessed something remarkable, a predator learning peace through a human act of care. Kareth stood still, his movements uncertain as he tried to mimic what he had seen Liana do so effortlessly. The small brush felt strange in his clawed hand, light, fragile, and oddly soft compared to the cold tools he was used to handling. He dragged it gently over the ridges of his head, just as she had shown him. The bristles caught slightly against the rough scales, making a faint scraping sound. Instinctively, he flinched at first, but then he adjusted, angling the brush with more care. The motion grew smoother with every pass. The sensation was new to him, unexpected, almost soothing. Liana watched quietly, a faint smile playing on her lips. She had expected him to give up after the first try, maybe to lose patience or retreat into the reserved discipline that all Varex soldiers carried like armor. But Kareth surprised her. His focus didn't waver. He was completely absorbed in the simple, repetitive act of brushing, his usually rigid shoulders beginning to relax. The moment was still, almost fragile, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The hum of the machines in the background faded away. It was only the quiet sound of the brush moving across his head and the soft rhythm of breathing that filled the lab. Liana could see the change in his posture. The tension that had always been there, coiled tightly under his skin, seemed to ease. His chest rose and fell more evenly, his stance softened. She realized then that it wasn't just a moment of curiosity for him. It was something deeper. Kareth had lived his entire life in a world built on control, survival, and strength. His people valued silence, precision, and dominance, not comfort or stillness. Yet now, as he brushed gently across the hardened plates of his head, he felt something he couldn't name. The small tug of the bristles against his skin brought not pain, but calm. He didn't understand it, but it made him feel lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. He glanced toward Liana, unsure if he was doing it right, but she didn't correct him. She simply watched with a quiet smile, her expression warm and reassuring. When their eyes met, something passed between them that didn't need translation. It wasn't language or logic, it was understanding. Two beings from entirely different worlds had found common ground in something as simple as care. For Kareth, it was the first time he had shared a moment that wasn't defined by fear or command. For Liana, it was proof that peace didn't always come through words. It could come through gestures, through patience, through a willingness to see the heart beneath the armor. After a few minutes, Kareth stopped brushing and handed the tool back to her. His clawed fingers brushed lightly against her palm, a brief, unintentional touch, but it carried meaning. He gave a small nod, almost a bow, then stepped back, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. Liana nodded in return, her smile gentle but full of emotion. In that quiet moment, between two beings who should have never understood each other, something powerful was born. Not friendship, not yet, but connection. And for Kareth, a creature of strength and silence, it was the first time he had ever felt peace. The days that followed were unlike anything the research station had seen before. At first, the crew simply found it amusing. A towering Varek soldier standing patiently in Liana's lab while she explained the proper way to use a hairbrush. Word spread quickly through the halls, and a few humans would linger by the observation glass, hiding smiles as they watched the unlikely sight. Kareth, the same alien guard who once seemed so cold and untouchable, was now learning something as gentle as self-care. Some joked quietly about it, but no one could deny there was something strangely beautiful about it, too. Soon the laughter faded, replaced by quiet curiosity. Other crew members began to notice small changes in Kareth's behavior. He still stood tall and alert, but there was a calmness in him that hadn't been there before. He spoke a little more often in his deep, gravelly tone. He seemed lighter somehow. What truly surprised everyone was what came next. One afternoon, Liana walked into the shared area near the labs and froze. There, sitting on the floor in a neat line, were 3 Varek soldiers, the same intimidating figures who once guarded the corridors with silent stares. Each one held a human brush, and Kareth stood beside them, giving slow, deliberate instructions through gestures and growls that somehow made sense. One of the younger aliens tried to mimic the brushing motion, his heavy claws clumsy against his scales. The others watched and followed, taking turns, patient and oddly focused. A few human engineers stood nearby, whispering in disbelief. "Are they teaching each other?" one asked softly. Another chuckled. "Looks like it." But beneath the humor there was respect. These creatures, once seen as predators and soldiers, were learning something far beyond human habits. They were learning gentleness. Liana stepped closer, careful not to interrupt. Kareth noticed her and gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning back to his students. The room was filled with the soft sound of brushes gliding over scales. It was rhythmic, almost peaceful. For the first time since the humans and Vareks had shared this space, there was no tension in the air, only quiet unity. Later that evening, the cafeteria buzzed with quiet talk. People spoke not about research or duties, but about what they had seen. "It's strange," one scientist said thoughtfully. "It's like they're changing," another replied. "Or maybe we are." The line between alien and human, between hunter and scientist, had begun to blur. The next morning, when Liana entered the lab, she noticed something new. On her workbench sat a small handmade brush, crude, made of wire and fabric, but clearly built by alien hands. It was Kareth's way of saying thank you, though he never spoke the words. She smiled, touched by the gesture. The station felt different now, warmer, softer, more alive. What had started as curiosity had turned into connection, and that connection had changed everyone. Weeks passed quietly aboard the station, but the change that had begun in one small lab continued to ripple outward. Humans and Vareks now worked side by side without the old tension that once filled every shared space. Where there had once been silence and suspicion, there was now conversation, even laughter. It wasn't loud or constant, but it was real. Liana often caught herself smiling when she saw Varek's guards sitting calmly while human crew members showed them how to use brushes properly, or when she noticed a Varex carefully cleaning their tools with slower, gentler movements. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. One evening, after finishing her research for the day, Liana sat alone at her desk. The brush that had started it all lay beside her notes, worn but clean. She picked it up, feeling its weight in her hand. It was strange to think that something so simple could become such a powerful bridge between two species. She opened her data file but hesitated before typing. She wasn't writing a technical report this time. This wasn't about scientific discovery or measurable progress. This was about what she had seen. A moment of stillness shared between beings who had once only known fear. Her fingers began to move across the keys, slowly at first, then faster as the story flowed out of her. She described the way Kareth had watched, learned, and then taught others. She wrote about how the station's atmosphere had shifted, how peace had settled in small acts rather than in grand treaties. She called her report The Brush, a study in shared stillness. The title made her smile. It wasn't dramatic or scientific, but it felt true. When the report circulated through the network, it reached both human and Varek's command. The initial reaction was confusion. Many couldn't understand how something as minor as a grooming tool could have any cultural meaning. But when the Varek's elders read it, something in them stirred. They began to discuss the idea of stillness, not as weakness, but as control. The concept spread quietly through their colonies, reshaping small parts of their philosophy. Within weeks, the phrase, "honor the still hand," became common among the Varek's youth. It was taught in their learning halls, a reminder that strength didn't always have to come from power or aggression. Sometimes true power lay in calmness, in restraint, in the ability to care. Stories began circulating among their kind of the human who taught through action rather than words, and the soldier who learned peace through a simple brush. Liana didn't expect any recognition for her work. For her, the reward was already there. In every moment she saw a Varex greet a human without fear, in the quiet smiles exchanged in the corridors. She had set out to study life beyond Earth, but what she found instead was a lesson about life itself, that understanding doesn't come from dominance, but from patience, from learning to be still together. Years passed, and the story of a human biologist and a Varex soldier became something more than a memory. It became history. The great hall on the newly built Alliance planet gleamed under soft golden light, filled with diplomats, scientists, and leaders from both species. It was the day humanity and the Varex officially signed their peace treaty, marking the end of centuries of quiet distance and the beginning of shared trust. In the center of the hall, beneath a transparent dome showing the stars above, stood a single glass case. Inside it rested something small and ordinary, a wooden hairbrush, smooth from use, simple in design. Yet to everyone there, it represented something far greater than technology or power. The inscription beneath it read, "It began with curiosity and ended with understanding." People stopped to look at it, whispering the words with quiet respect. Soldiers who had once trained for war now stood side by side with scientists who had once feared contact. The air was warm with a rare feeling, peace that had been earned, not imposed. For the Varex, the brush had become a sacred symbol. To them, it was no longer just a human object. It was a mark of transformation. They now taught their children to honor the still hand, a phrase that meant to act with calm, patience, and compassion. The lesson had spread far beyond one station. It had reached across generations. Liana, now older with soft gray in her hair, walked slowly through the hall. She moved past the crowd until she stood before the case. Her reflection in the glass met the reflection of the brush, and for a moment, she saw herself as she had been years ago, young, tired, brushing her hair alone on that distant research station. She smiled faintly. It seemed unbelievable that something so small, so ordinary, could have changed the course of two civilizations. Around her, people spoke of treaties, trade, and exploration, But she knew the truth ran deeper. Peace hadn't come from politics or power. It had begun in a moment of shared stillness, a gesture of simple kindness between two beings who didn't speak the same language, but somehow understood each other. As she stood there, one of the Varex delegates approached. His scaled crest shimmered softly in the light, and he bowed slightly before her. In his hands he carried a new brush, metallic, carefully crafted and elegant. "We made this," he said in a calm voice, his accent thick but clear. "For you." Liana accepted it with both hands, touched beyond words. It wasn't just a gift. It was a promise that the connection she had helped create would live on. Later, when she stepped outside beneath the stars, she looked up at the endless sky where it had all begun. The galaxy was vast and filled with noise, but for a moment, everything felt still again. She realized that no matter how far humanity traveled, no matter how many discoveries they made, the most powerful thing they could ever offer wasn't science or strength. It was understanding. And that, she thought with a soft smile, would always be humanity's greatest legacy.